Growing up in the 90s, I can't remember a time when hitchhiking was considered safe. It was popular in the 1970s, but even then, people caught on pretty quickly to the fact that it could be dangerous. Unfortunately, a lot of people, especially young women, still caught rides with strangers, and some of them never came home. This is the story of a series of hitchhiker murders in the 1970s in Santa Rosa, California. At least 7 girls and young women were killed while hitchhiking, and their murders remain unsolved over 40 years later. Our story begins on February 4th, 1972. 12-year-old Maureen Sterling and her 13-year-old friend Yvonne Weber went missing from Redwood Ice Skating Rink in Santa Rosa. They were last seen getting into a car, and while the Santa Rosa police initially thought they were runaways, Yvonne's stepfather believed they were hitchhiking. Just a month later, on March 4th, 19-year-old Kim Allen left her job at a health food store in Larkspur, California around 5 p.m. Both Kim's mother and one of her teachers at Santa Rosa Junior College had warned her of the dangers of hitchhiking, but she didn't listen. On the evening of March 4th, she attempted to hitchhike back to Santa Rosa, something she did regularly. 2 men gave her a ride, but let her out at the northbound on-ramp at about 5:30 p.m. Kim's body was found the next day in a creek bank just off a road about 8 miles southeast of Santa Rosa. She was nude, and there was evidence of sexual assault. However, there were no other obvious injuries on her body except for scratch marks where she had fallen down the embankment and marks on her neck, wrists, and ankles, probably made by wire or rope. Her cause of death was asphyxiation, and the coroner determined it had taken her at least half an hour to die. Needless to say, people were shocked by Kim's brutal rape and murder. A friend of hers, Fred Samia, started a reward fund with a $50 donation. There was a scholarship established in her name, and 10 detectives were put on her case. The same teacher who had warned Kim about hitchhiking later revealed that 2 of her other students had also been killed while hitchhiking. After Kim's death, police received an increase in rape reports from hitchhikers. In fact, about 80% of reported rapes in Sonoma County occurred while hitchhiking. Less than 2 months later, on April 25th, 20-year-old Santa Rosa Junior College student Jeanette Kamali left home around 9:30 a.m. to hitchhike to class. She was last seen getting into a 1950s pickup with a white man in his 20s or 30s at the wheel. Jeanette's roommate reported her missing later that night when she realized she hadn't shown up for classes and wouldn't have just skipped on a whim. Jeanette's body has never been found, and most people who have researched this case don't seem to consider her one of the confirmed victims. But after her disappearance, and likely in conjunction with Kim Allen's murder, students at the nearby Sonoma State College set up a carpool so students wouldn't be as tempted to hitchhike to class. The carpool was advertised on a bulletin board at the school, along with numbers to call if you were stranded and needed a ride, and a list of alleged assailants and descriptions of them and their cars. But on December 14th, another body was found. The body of the young girl was found 30 feet down an embankment off Calistoga Road. She was nude and almost completely frozen, making her well preserved. She was estimated to have died between December 1st and December 8th from a broken neck. She's thought to have either jumped from or been thrown out of a moving vehicle and down the embankment. There was no evidence of any sort of assault, sexual or otherwise. The next day, the girl was identified as 13-year-old Lori Lee Cursa. Lori had run away from her home about a month earlier and was living with friends in the Santa Rosa area. In addition to frequently running away, Lori was known to hitchhike. She was last seen by her friends on November 30th, and after her body was found, a man contacted the sheriff's office with some stunning information. According to him, sometime between December 3rd and December 9th, he saw a white van parked on Calistoga Road. 2 men walked on either side of a young girl, leading her. Then they all got in the van, and it sped off. His description of the girl matched what Lori had been wearing the day she was last seen. Despite her being a runaway, the sheriff's office handled Lori's death as a homicide. A $500 reward was set up for information leading to the killer of Lori or of Kim Allen. On December 28th, two teenage boys hiking in Franz Valley stumbled on human remains. Other than a necklace and an earring, there was no clothing found at the scene, and the bodies were completely skeletonized. At first, it was difficult to determine even how many bodies there were, let alone how long they'd been there, though two skulls were eventually found, so it was presumed there were two bodies. Less than a week later, the remains were identified as those of Maureen Sterling and Yvonne Weber. Their bodies had been there too long to determine date or cause of death, but since they went missing February 4th, I think it's safe to assume they weren't killed too long after that. On the evening of July 31st, 1973, a man riding his motorcycle off Franz Valley Road found the body of another young woman. The body was estimated to have been there between 3 and 7 days and was found within 4 feet of the bodies of Maureen Sterling and Yvonne Weber. Understandably, these murders were thought to be connected. I'm not sure if investigators had connected the murder of Kim Allen or the disappearance of Jeanette Kamali to these murders at this point. The victim was found nude, but due to decomposition, it was impossible to determine if she'd been sexually assaulted. A $2,500 reward was set up in exchange for information about the latest murder victim. A few weeks later, dental records identified the girl as 15-year-old Caroline Davis. Caroline had run away from home on February 6th and was reported missing that same day. Soon after, her parents received a letter from her saying she had left voluntarily and didn't plan on coming back. She was last seen by her grandmother on July 15th in Garberville, about a 2.5-hour drive from Santa Rosa. Her grandmother left her in front of a post office, and Caroline set off hitchhiking toward Modesto. She's thought to have died around July 20th. It was soon determined that Caroline's death was caused by strychnine poisoning. Strychnine can be administered orally or intravenously, and someone exposed to high enough doses can die within half an hour. Caroline's death is thought to have taken between 2 and 3 hours. The 1-year anniversary of the discovery of the bodies of Maureen Sterling and Yvonne Weber would bring yet another gruesome find. On December 28, 1973, two teenagers boating in Marquest Creek found the naked body of a woman, half submerged under a log. The woman had been dead between 2 and 7 days, hogtied and seemingly strangled. It took investigators 2 hours to remove her body from underneath the log. Early the following January, the woman was identified as 23-year-old Teresa Walsh. Teresa lived in a town called Miranda, about 10 miles north of Garberville, where Caroline Davis was last seen. Teresa was last seen on December 22nd near Malibu by friends who said she planned to hitchhike home to Garberville for Christmas. Unfortunately, it seemed like she had never made it. The last confirmed victim was found by hikers in Rincon Valley. The body was found in a ravine off Calistoga Road, about 100 yards from where the body of Lori Lee Cursa had been found. The body was almost completely skeletonized, if not entirely. At first, investigators couldn't even determine sex, but assumed the body was that of a female because of the small frame. It has been confirmed since that the body was female. The woman had been hogtied with ropes around her neck, feet, and hands, similar to Teresa Walsh. Teeth and a hard contact lens were also found at the scene. At first, the remains were thought to be 5 to 7 years old, but I'm not sure about this. This conclusion was made because it was thought that if the body was newer, a soft contact lens would have been found instead. The first FDA-approved soft contact lenses came on the market in 1971. They soon became more popular than hard contacts, but plenty of people still wore them in 1979. Even today, about 10% of contact lens wearers still wear hard contacts. So I don't think it's too crazy that someone who died in the late 1970s would still be wearing hard contacts. The body remains unidentified to this day. At first, there was speculation that this was the body of Jeanette Kamali, but dental records would eventually rule her out. These are thought to be the 7 confirmed victims of the killer, as well as Jeanette Kamali, who likely at least met the same fate. But there are a few unsolved cases some people believe may be tied to the hitchhiker murders in Santa Rosa. On March 16, 1971, 17-year-old Lisa Smith was seen hitchhiking on Hearn Avenue in Santa Rosa at about 7 p.m. A few days later, a young woman was being treated at Novato General Hospital. She gave her name as Lisa Smith and told the staff she'd been beaten up by a man while hitchhiking. She also gave her age as 21. The hospital has no records of this visit, and I can't even find them online. They've probably changed names since then. So it can't be determined if this was the Lisa Smith that went missing on March 16th. She's never been seen or heard from again. On September 9th, 1975, the body of Deborah Carrick was found off Highway 64, about 13 miles west of Cameron, Arizona. Deborah had been traveling from Maryland to California for a friend's wedding, but planned to visit national parks along the way. Even before her body was found, her ID was found at an intersection in Santa Rosa, close to where the bodies of some of the other victims had been found, though I can never determine exactly which victims. Her murder remains unsolved. 15-year-old Carrie Ann Graham and 14-year-old Francine Trimble lived in Forestville, California, about 11 miles west of Santa Rosa. The two friends were last seen alive in December 1978. Some sources said they were going to visit a shopping mall in Santa Rosa, but Carrie's sister would later say that she thought they were going to a party. Regardless of their destination, they never made it home. Their skeletonized bodies were found about 83 miles north, close to Willits, California, the following July, but not identified until 2015. Investigators suspect foul play in their deaths, and the investigation is ongoing. There's a book called Lost Coast Highway by Gray George that details Carrie and Francine's case, as well as the hitchhiker murders and the potential connection between the two. I just finished reading this book, and it's really interesting. I recommend it to anyone who's interested in learning more about either of these cases. It's free if you have Kindle Unlimited, but if you don't, check the description for an Amazon affiliate link to purchase it. In the summer of 1973, San Francisco had its own string of unsolved murders, and some of the details were similar to the killings in Santa Rosa. All of the victims were girls or young women in their late teens or early 20s. All of the bodies were nude, but there were no signs of sexual assault. Unlike the bodies in Santa Rosa, all of these were found in schoolyards or parks. I have seen speculation that the murders in these two towns might be connected. Santa Rosa is just over an hour's drive from San Francisco, so it is conceivable that a killer could travel between these two towns. But who committed these murders? Let's take a look at some of these speculation and potential culprits. By far, the most well-known theory in this case is that the murders were committed by the Zodiac Killer. One of the most notorious serial killers in recent history, this still unidentified individual has been linked to at least 5 murders in Northern California in the late 1960s, and is thought to be responsible for many more. During the Santa Rosa investigation, Sheriff Don Stripke believed those murders might be connected to the Zodiac Killer. By this time, the Zodiac had slowed his killings, but said that he would continue killing in various ways. This, in addition to witchcraft symbols being found near bodies of some of the victims, which was also associated with the Zodiac, lends credibility to this theory. Sheriff's Detective Sergeant Butch Carlstedt thought the Zodiac Killer was making a Z across the Bay Area with his killings. Several murders unsolved at the time showed this pattern from California, Washington, Utah, and New Mexico. However, most of these murders, if not all, turned out to be the work of Ted Bundy, who we'll talk more about later. The next 2 suspects in the Santa Rosa murders were also considered Zodiac suspects at one point. Arthur Lee Allen was fired from a teaching job in 1968 after allegations of child molestation. He also lived in Santa Rosa at one point and would have crossed paths with several of the victims. In fact, he would have been getting home from work on February 4th, around the same time that Maureen Sterling and Yvonne Weber went missing. In his book, Zodiac Unmasked, The Identity of America's Most Elusive Serial Killer, author Robert Graysmith briefly discusses possible forensic evidence found by Sergeant John Burke of the Santa Rosa Police Department. Burke states that they found hairs on the Santa Rosa victims' bodies that matched hairs in the trunk of Allen's car. Interestingly, the hairs turned out to be chipmunk hairs. In Zodiac Unmasked, Graysmith also recalls a story told to him by an unnamed woman who was a retired Sheriff's Department employee. In 1976, this woman found out about a teacher at Santa Rosa Junior College who had recently been killed in a car accident. When going through his things, the man's wife found drawings of several of his students, including Kim Allen. The drawings seemed to suggest that the man was interested in sadomasochism and had an unhealthy fascination with Kim. The man was never named in this book, and I can't find substantial confirmation of his name anywhere. But online consensus seems to be that this man was Frederick Manally, who, like Arthur Lee Allen, had been considered a Zodiac suspect at one point. However, other than his connection to and strange obsession with one of the victims, there's nothing else to tie him to the murders. At one point in the Santa Rosa investigation, the Hillside Stranglers were considered as possible culprits by investigators. Angelo Buono and his cousin Kenneth Bianchi were convicted of killing 9 women, ranging in age from 12 to 28, in Los Angeles in the late 1970s, and dumping their nude bodies on hillsides. Both were sentenced to life in prison. Bianchi remains incarcerated, and Buono died of a heart attack in 2002. One last person who was looked into that I thought was worth mentioning is Ted Bundy. Like the Zodiac Killer, Ted Bundy needs no introduction, as he's arguably the most notorious serial killer in recent history. Bundy was executed in 1989 for the murders of 2 women in Florida, but before his death, he confessed to murdering at least 27 other women. Bundy sometimes drove hundreds of miles to kill, and he was reportedly in California in 1974. Bundy was eventually ruled out because credit card records said he was in Washington state during some of the disappearances. However, this leads me into the next theory I want to talk about, and one that might not rule Bundy out completely. According to this theory, all or at least some of the murdered girls were murdered by different people, and the high body count was a morbid coincidence. Despite its known dangers, hitchhiking was pretty common during this time, and people who chose to engage in it were leaving themselves vulnerable to all sorts of predators. Most of the victims also had different causes of death. Kim Allen and Teresa Walsh were strangled, while Caroline Davis was poisoned, and Lori Lee Cursa was seemingly thrown out of a moving vehicle. It's unusual for one killer to use so many different methods. It would also have been easy for one or more truck drivers to commit these murders. Truck drivers are constantly on the move, and it would be easy for them to commit a murder in one town and be in another town or even another state by the next day. It's conceivable that some of the murders were committed by truck drivers who picked up hitchhikers and saw it as an opportunity. With that being said, let's take a look at a few other known killers who could have committed one or more of these murders. Known as the I-55 Strangler, Roger Reese Kibb preyed on sex workers and women waiting on roadside assistance in Northern California in the 1970s and 80s, leaving their bodies along highways. He was sentenced to 6 consecutive life terms in 2009 and remains in prison today. In 1978, Lawrence Singleton picked up 15-year-old hitchhiker Mary Vincent in Berkeley, California. He proceeded to rape her, cut off her arms at the elbows, and leave her to die in a culvert. She managed to escape, and Singleton was convicted of her rape and kidnapping the following year. He was sentenced to 14 years in prison but was paroled in 1987. After that, he moved to Florida, where he killed a prostitute named Roxanne Hayes in 1997. He was sentenced to death for her murder, but died in prison of cancer in 2002. In 1964, a 15-year-old Edmund Kemper killed his grandparents just to see what it felt like. He was sent to a state hospital for mentally ill convicts, but released in 1969. In 1971, he got a job with the Department of Transportation and soon started picking up female hitchhikers. At first, he would let them go with no incidents, but later began killing them. In April 1973, he killed his mother and his mother's friend, then turned himself in. He received 8 life sentences later that year. This does rule him out for some of the murders, of course, but Most of his victims were killed in Santa Cruz, which isn't too far from Santa Rosa. So again, it's easy to see how he could have traveled between the two cities. In 1988, Jackie Ray Hovater was found guilty of the 1984 rape and murder of Dana Walsh. Dana was from Willits, California, and her body was found in Scotia, about a 3-hour drive from Santa Rosa. According to Lost Coast Highway, Hovater was also arrested in 1984 for kidnapping, rape, and attempted murder of a 15-year-old girl. While in prison, he confessed to 3 other murders that had taken place between 1980 and 1984, as well as the murder of Dana Walsh. He also reportedly confessed to his cellmates that he had ordered a hit against his kidnapping victim so she couldn't testify against him in court. Of course, the murder of Dana Walsh was later confirmed, but I don't think any of his other 3 murder victims were ever found. He was tried and convicted for the kidnapping and rape and sentenced to 20 years in prison. He pled no contest to solicitation of murder for hire and was sentenced to 4 more years in prison. Hovater was sentenced to death for Dana Walsh's murder, but his sentence was commuted to life in prison in March 2019 when California Governor Gavin Newsom signed an executive order to repeal the death penalty in the state. He remains in prison, and since he went to prison, there have been no reported hitchhiker murders on the 101. Rodney Alcala is another killer you may have heard of. Known as the dating game killer because he was on a TV show called The Dating Game during his murder spree, Alcala killed at least 7 people in California and New York in the 1970s. In 1968, Alcala was caught by a witness raping an 8-year-old girl in Hollywood. He fled to the East Coast and was caught in 1971, but only remained in prison until 1974. This rules him out for most of the murders, but he did return to California upon his release and killed 12-year-old Robin Samso near Bolsa Chica State Beach in 1979. Depending on when Jane Doe died, he might have killed her as well as some of the other possible victims I mentioned earlier who died in the late 1970s. One more final point of speculation I want to touch on is the idea that the killer lived in Santa Rosa or at least knew the area well. Some of the bodies were dumped in remote locations that wouldn't have been known to visitors or passerbys. That might rule out most of the suspects mentioned here, but I did want to cover every possible angle and theory. This is my own speculation based on anecdotal evidence, but I think the killer is probably someone we've never heard of. With advancing technology, hopefully one day we'll be able to figure out who committed these murders, whether it was one person or many, and bring them to justice. Jeanette Kamali is an Asian female who was 20 years old when she went missing on April 25, 1972. She was last seen being picked up by a white man in a faded brown Chevrolet pickup truck. She was 5 feet 5 inches tall, 120 pounds, and had brown eyes and black hair. She was last seen wearing blue denim pants, a dark sweater, and sandals. She has a large birthmark under her right breast and wears a dental bridge. If she were alive today, she would be 67 years old. If you have any information about the disappearance of Jeanette Kamali, please contact the Sonoma County Sheriff's Office at 707-565-2185. The Sonoma County Jane Doe is a female, about 5 feet 3 inches tall and between 16 and 21 years old at the time of death. She is thought to have died between 3 and 7 years before the discovery of her body in 1979. One of her arms was broken, and she had a fractured rib at some point in her life that healed before her death. Also found near her body were a hard contact lens and a metal candy tin with cherries on it. If you have any information about Jane Doe's identity, please contact the Sonoma County Sheriff Coroner at 707-565-5070. So, what are your thoughts on the Santa Rosa hitchhiker murders? Do you think they were committed by one of the suspects listed here or someone else entirely? Do you think they were the work of the same person or different killers? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.